So before we delve into this topic, and today I will say I'm going to focus a little bit more on anxiety. I'll talk a little bit about depression, but the spotlight is going to be a little bit more about anxiety. They coexist a lot, depression and anxiety. There are disorders in both realms as well, and people have co-occurring problems as well, right? So, but we'll focus a little bit more on anxiety, and maybe at next time, at some other point, we'll do gear it more towards depression as well. But again, these two coexist a lot, these two disorders and syndromes. But I wanted to start with, real quick, where did anxiety start, if you think about it? Anxiety, fear, negative emotions. It starts in the story of Genesis, Adam and Eve. Let's do a real quick analysis of this. Genesis chapter 3, verse 8. Genesis 3:8. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. Then the Lord God called to Adam and said to him, "Where are you?" So not only where are you in terms of a physical position in the Garden of Eden, not in terms of where are you in terms of the coordinates, right? But where are you mentally, right? Where are you emotionally? What are you focused on? Where are you? So he said, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked and hid myself." And he said, God, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you that you should not eat?" And the story goes on and on and on. And it goes up to, blaming, "Oh, the woman you gave me. Oh, the serpent deceived me. Oh," so the blame game started. But that was the first experience of fear that human beings went through. Where are you? Where has your mind been on for the last month, the last year? The pandemic has unfortunately created a lot of problems. If there were any pre-existing problems that people had mental health-wise, it has exacerbated them. Isolation, fear of this disease that no one knew about, right? Fear of contracting the disease. And as people isolated more, their symptoms of depression and anxiety went up higher, unfortunately. And not only that, but also substance use and so on. So the anxious brain, I think it's important to understand, in the experience of Adam and Eve, we have a perfect garden with everything that they needed, all the resources, right? So there was no survival of the fittest. They didn't have to fight for food because certain animals were attacking them, and they had to live, inside some kind of shelter so that the lions and tigers, none of that existed pre-sin, pre-original sin. But when there was this event of not following God's will, their eyes were opened. They were in a position that they have never been in. It created a surge of anxious, apprehensive thinking, and they were afraid of the being that offered them safety, comfort, security. They were afraid of their own God. They were afraid of their own God. And when we look at statistics, anxiety disorders are one of the ones that have the biggest concerns in terms of when we compare them to other disorders, right? There was a study done in 2010, and the lifetime prevalence rate, meaning for a person during their lifetime, about almost 30% of those folks during their lifetime experienced some episode of anxiety, worry, apprehension. For younger folk, youth, 32%. That's pretty high. So it's one of the highest, or if not the highest. Now, if we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders to categorize and diagnose certain specific anxieties, we have a bunch, and these are some of the basic ones. Right now, categorized under anxiety disorders, all of these. Generalized anxiety, sort of state of excessive worry, anxiety, restlessness, difficulty controlling the worry. That's the key. Sometimes we worry about certain things, but we have a mechanism to down on that worry, right? We might distract ourselves. We might cook a meal. We might go play sports. And exercise, by the way, is great for anxiety. We might change our focus of attention, not have tunnel vision, and we might be able to do that and just have some periodic or situational anxiety and worry. But when it's more generalized, it's excessive, predominant. People find it hard to sleep at night at times because they go to sleep with the same tape or podcast because your head about and it in a state of again tension. So a lot of people with GAD, generalized anxiety, may have tension, headaches, and other symptoms, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, and so on. Now, in social anxiety, there's fear or marked anxiety in social situations where a person perceives that they are under scrutiny by others, right? In panic disorder, now you can have a panic attack in any of disorders. You can have panic attacks and have depression. You can have panic attacks and have just situational stress. Or you can have it as a standalone disorder. It's a recurrent, unexpected, abrupt, intense surge of fear, anxiety, which can kind of peak in minutes, right? Maybe 15 minutes. It peaks where the person's having palpitations, difficulty breathing. They may experience other things like they may feel like they're disembodied, right, depersonalized, and so on. Agoraphobia, which you may have heard about, right? Marked fear and anxiety about open spaces, enclosed spaces, and a whole set of other situations, public transportation, where the person believes that wherever they are in those contexts, they're going to be struggling to escape that context, right? So if someone is afraid of tunnels, for instance, or afraid of height, well, heights would be acrophobia, but I'll say afraid of tunnels and they're going to the airport, that's a tough one, right? Because you have to go through a lot of tunnels here in Boston. Specific phobia, anxiety about a specific object or situation, right? That would be like, arachnophobia. I talked about a tarantula this morning. Right? There's a specific object that is a lot of fear and anxiety. There are anxiety for children and even some adults. Recurrent excessive distress or worry when you're anticipating separation from home or attachment figures, right? And I'm not going to go over every one of these symptoms, but some common physical manifestations of anxiety, heart rate palpitations, difficulty breathing, chest pressure, dizziness, abdominal distress, shaking, and so on, muscle tension that I talked about, hot, cold chills, sweating, choking sensations. A lot of these can just be short-lived if it's a panic attack, right? Cognitive manifestations of anxiety, meaning how your thinking is, your planning, and so on. Worry, we talked about worry this morning. Fear of losing control, poor coping beliefs, automatic thoughts, images, memories, right? Poor focus and confusion, hypervigilance, So if someone has PTSD, they may display this characteristic of being part of the brain that has to do with detecting threats. Paranoid, right? Narrowing of attention, these are cognitive manifestations, perceptions of unreality or detachment, like you are observing your own self from a third-person perspective or your own environment, and you feel like you're disembodied or detached. Emotional manifestations, terrified, nervous, tense, uneasy, frustrated, jittery, jumpy, so on and so forth. And behavioral avoidance, right? That's one of the biggest, avoidance and escape are the biggest strategies that over the long haul maintain your anxiety. So you have to kind of really investigate what is the underlying core fear, right, that is driving the anxiety that keeps you in that avoidant state, right? So I remember as a first-year college student, once in a while you may have situational anxiety about a new situation, right? New environment. And so I went to class, and it was a huge auditorium with a lot of students. And I remember that first day, I walked in late. I walked in late to the classroom. I looked outside, I could see like here, I could see, I'm like, wow, that's a huge auditorium. There's a lot of people. I walked in late. And I sat down in the back, hoping nobody would see me. But I remember that when I sat, I felt my heart rate. I think my blood pressure went up. My heart was pumping fast. I could hear it, and I'm like, oh, ooh. So someone with perhaps social anxiety, performance anxiety, might not even be able to go in, right? They'll run because they're late. They don't want to be scrutinized or judged because they're a little bit late. And you feel like all eyes are on you, right? So I felt like that, like all eyes were on me. But then I thought consequences. Okay, if I leave the lecture, what if it's on the test? What if I fail? So the what ifs there were a little bit more functional, because there are some what ifs that are not really helpful, right? But I was thinking about the consequences of my decision whether I stayed or left because I felt really anxious. So I decided to stay, and lo and behold, the environment started to becoming less threatening to me. No one was looking at me. The professor wasn't staring at me. This is not high school, it's college, right? Yeah, in high school they might go around and be like, oh, you're late, go to the principal's office, or they write you up. In college, there and taking it all in, naturally anxiety will arise, and if you stay with it, maybe do some other things in your mind, distract yourself, we'll talk about other strategies, it should subside over time, right? So avoidance, escape, difficulty speaking, these are some of the behavioral symptoms. Freezing, motionless, some people will just kind of freeze, their arms will be locked in, their voice will be different. They will not be able to express themselves as adequately as they should. Some other symptoms are you pursue your safety, your comfort zone. We got to really know what the comfort zone is and what adapt. Hyperventilation, right? So these are some of these symptoms. Now we want to differentiate between stress, anxiety, fear, right? So fear, anxiety, we'll talk about that, but let's talk about stress versus anxiety. Now, we might use them interchangeably. Stress, anxiety, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, I'm overwhelmed, right? You'll hear these complaints. You'll have those complaints. I'm overwhelmed, this is too much, I'm stressed out, I'm distressed. Okay, so stress is perception of threat. Now, there's a little model that I like by these There's an arousal, right? As you are in front of an identifiable stimulus, object, situation, or person, how you perceive that, how it excites or the body, right, through the sympathetic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. So there's a rise in perhaps stress, right, anxiety that we call it, but it's different. We want to differentiate the two. And then there's perceived uncontrollability, right? Perceived aversiveness and perceived uncontrollability. So you perceive the stress. Are you aroused to the stress? Does it change something about your function? You know, do your pupils dilate, right? Does your heart rate go up a little bit? Do you perceive that as aversive? Do you think you can cope with it, right? And do you think can you control it, right? So not everything will be a stressor, right? It depends how you react to it. So if you use a scale, if your belief in your capacity to cope is less than your perceived threat of the situation, yeah, that could be stress. Now, anxiety is more of the anticipation of a threat, right? And we'll talk more about that. And we talked about it in the morning as well. So anxiety and fear. Again, fear, we'll go over it again. Basic automatic state of alarm, consisting of a perception or conclusion of imminent threat or danger to your safety and security. All right? So if I've never gone on a roller coaster, and this is the first time that I go, when I start going up and I'm about to take the dive, yeah, I'm going to be releasing a lot of adrenaline, right? Epinephrine. So fear, automatic state of alarm, right? And you are identifying that. Is it coming from a bear right in front of you? Is it coming from when you're driving, somebody cuts you off, perhaps it's a truck? That's sheer fear because you know this is dangerous, right? But someone else who has had experience on the road and has had trucks kind of cut them off, maybe they're not as fearful as you are because maybe they found a way to get around that, right? So again, it's about that perception, right? Anxiety is that prolonged, complex emotional state when we continue to anticipate a future situation, right? We may not even be in it, but we're prognosticating that the meeting we're having with our boss is going to go haywire. We're predicting that the first date we're having with the person that we just met, that you'll probably make a mistake or you'll say something that you'll regret because maybe in the past you had some negative experiences. When you start predicting certain things and asking yourself, what if this, what if that, in a negative fashion, then you're putting yourself in anticipating all this threat, which hasn't happened yet. And you feel it's unpredictable, uncontrollable, and it threatens your interests. The core fear that underlies anxiety involves the tendency to automatically think dangerously, to catastrophize. So catastrophic thinking, it's quite often, I see it quite often, catastrophic thinking. We exaggerate the probability and the severity of bad outcomes, even of common situations, common everyday situations. Now, what is that core fear? That state of automatically assuming that this is something aversive that you don't like to experience, right? First day of school for a child, yeah, sure. They're going to be like a little bit anxious about it, right? But if that child doesn't go to school, how is he or she going to learn to communicate with others and to let the anxiety subside by itself slowly, using that example, obviously. There are other examples. Now, there are dangerous thoughts, dangerous cognitions in catastrophic thinking or catastrophizing that creates this loop in which you are caught on and you ignore other things about your environment. It leads to overestimation of threat. It leads to exaggeration of the actual situation. it can lead to unrealistic thoughts regarding the likelihood that the worst case scenario will actually occur. When we're in that danger zone, when we're in that anxiety zone, we're locked in. And if you've seen someone that has experienced this, or if you have a family member or a friend that has experienced this, if they're in the midst of a panic attack, it's like you're flying and you have moderate turbulence. Now, most of you might have experienced mild turbulence on a plane. But my wife and I, we experienced moderate turbulence some couple of years ago. We were flying back to Texas, I think. Now, we had to really grab onto the seat because it felt like it was shaking a lot. So then I told my wife, imagine what severe turbulence looks like flying when you're in the air. So when you're locked in, moderate turbulence just takes over if it's a panic attack, or if it's a heightened anxiety where your mind is just producing all these negative assumptions, or creating all these negative assumptions about something that hasn't happened yet. So the brain is just locked in, scanning, looking for what's wrong. All you see are the danger cues. Even your memory is biased. So at that moment, all you can think about is negative things that have happened to you, right? And I know that the brain has that capacity to put a spotlight on those situations where perhaps you have been more anxious about. And so what happens is the hippocampus, for instance, a part of the limbic system that has to do with memory information, perhaps it's more active. The amygdala is more active because it's just throwing emotional memories, negative emotional memories. Like you can imagine, like if you had a fight with a family member, a friend, or somebody, you might imagine, not only the content, but what was said, how horrible it was, how they might have disrespected you, and so on. So, and there's this reasoning ability is just captured by this zone, unfortunately. So we need to get out of that zone quickly, as quickly as possible, to be able to stabilize our nervous system, right? And this morning I was talking about God being the anchor for the soul, right? Remember that guy out there in the ocean? He needed to throw out a sea anchor, right? So there are different ways we can try to anchor ourselves in the present, not in the future, to take the ride a little bit better and not feel like we're about to collapse. Right? Now, vulnerability and helplessness, this formula, I kind of like from a cognitive standpoint, right? So if we mix overestimation of threat, right? If we're overestimating threat and danger, and we're underestimating our ability to cope and deal with it, yeah, that's going to be high anxiety. It's going to be that roller coaster ride. And so we have to figure out a way to send a message down, top down, from our conscious thinking to areas of the brain that are detecting the threat, like the limbic system, and tell that part of the brain, oh, that's a false alarm, right? So here comes an automatic thought that tells you, it could be anything, right? Oh no, when I walk into the store, I got to get food, everyone's going to be staring at me. I'm going to make a mess of myself. I need to find an exit point right away. So we haven't even gotten into the store yet, and we're already telling ourselves it's going to go haywire. So we need to find a way to channel that differently. So overestimation of threat, underestimation of your capacity to cope, heightened anxiety. And in trying to figure out the profile, right, for you, for your family member, even if you don't have clinical anxiety, even if you have situational anxiety, where there are certain things that are more anxiety-provoking than not, we want to figure out, okay, what is the concern? What is my anxious concern? What is the overestimated probability, right? So research, for instance, research shows that people spend too much time worrying and creating these apprehensive, negative futures or possibilities that haven't happened yet, that most of those things that they have focused on and put their energy on actually do not come to fruition. They never happen, those things. Some people that may have anxiety about driving, right? If they say to themselves, oh, and I'm sure somebody's going to crash, you live in that brain. You're already putting yourself in that situation, and you're going to be extra careful, but you're not at peace. We got to dial down on that alarm. Overestimate the severity, right? How bad can it be, right? Is it the end of the world? Will it be important 6 months from now, right? So you made a mistake in the past. What is the likelihood that you'll make the same mistake? Or what is the likelihood that other people will notice that mistake? What is your brain thinking? Are you locked in that anxious cycle of thinking? And the Lord wants us to think on other things, right? Think on other things. Tune out of the zone of stress. Tune into the zone of peace and certainty about today. Tomorrow, someone said, yesterday is gone. Tomorrow never comes. All we have is today. Right? All we have is today. So vulnerability, helpless cognitions, thinking styles. What's that profile look like? We got to look again for that anxious concern. Helplessness thinking. Do you feel helpless? And what is that desired coping response? I would like to be able to do this, this, and that. I would like to be able to come out of the zone of worry and distract myself with other things or shift my attention elsewhere. There are cognitive errors that are typical across depressive disorders, anxiety disorders. And if we had to kind of classify a little bit sort of these domains of cognitive errors, we could talk about three major types. One is, again, that I've talked about it already, but I'll put more emphasis on this now. Selective attention bias, right? What is that selective attention bias that you are preoccupied with? So how is it that you are narrowing, right, your attention? And when we're narrowing our attention, it's interesting because we have certain neurotransmitters that are activated. Now, if you're narrowing your attention to learning an instrument, for instance, if you're narrowing your attention to learning a new task, a new skill, nothing wrong with that. Unless you take, you're in it for hours and hours, that might be different, right? But if you're narrowing your attention and you're selecting only the components that activate that internal alarm, right? That person looked at me wrong. Oh, there's something behind that tree. Oh, I walked into a room and someone didn't say hi to me. Oh, I went to do my homework and there was an intrusive thought that came to my mind. Oh, I was trying to read the Bible, but suddenly my mind drifted elsewhere and I started thinking about a horrible experience that I had. And then you try to figure out, why did that come to my mind? You have to analyze why it came to your mind. So when we turn the attention meter elsewhere, there is a cognitive shift. So in people that have clinical depression and clinical anxiety, what happens is, at least cognitively, there is a narrowing of that attention, and that's the next part we're talking about, and there's a shift between from normal, more adaptive, more balanced thinking to more distress, more apprehension and anxiety and depression, more feelings of worthlessness, more thoughts of low self-concept, low self-esteem. You're kind of taken control by this distortive process where the attention goes elsewhere, and you're narrowing your attention, as we have been talking. And there are specific cognitive distortions that we see across depression and anxiety, and I'll name some of those, not all of them. We talked about catastrophic thinking. But it's nice to define it here to kind of know. Because as you become more aware of certain patterns of thinking, you can produce a strategy to perhaps modify your feelings and emotions and your behaviors, right? So one model is in cognitive behavioral therapy is, thoughts, images, automatic thoughts produce emotions, feelings, which produce behaviors, whether it's avoidance and escape and anxiety, for instance, which can then produce behaviors, and behaviors can produce over time certain habits. And a lot of times when people shift attention elsewhere, right, their attention meter goes to the more depressed or the more anxious, they become embedded in this habitual form of thinking that it's central around a specific domain. Like if it's your worthlessness, you'll go and you make your own inventory of the things that you experience that make you think like you are worthless. And you might ignore in your inventory of yourself the events and situations where someone highlighted your strengths, where someone highlighted your ability to overcome certain things, where someone highlighted your strengths, and because, again, you are funneling and filtering this in this specific depressive way, you forget to realize that there are other things that, in your experience, that can balance you out. Catastrophic thinking, focusing on the worst possible case scenario on an anxious situations, overestimating threat and danger. Jumping to conclusions, expecting that a dreaded outcome extremely likely. Right away, we can make that mistake. Tunnel vision, I've talked about it, but let's define it. Focusing only on possible threat-relevant information while ignoring evidence of safety, right? Emotional reasoning, assuming that the more intense the anxiety, the greater the actual threat. Again, you make an assumption or a conclusion based on a situational or fleeting emotion. So we need to be aware of that, because technically the way the brain was created, if you think about it, we have the frontal, prefrontal cortex. That's the decision center of the brain, right? But a lot of times when there is symptomatic anxiety and depression, guess who does the driving? Other regions of the brain, the limbic system, like amygdala. And that's a roller coaster, as I mentioned. That's a roller coaster because you take that emotional ride, it's just a storm. It's a big surge. And unfortunately, a lot of people go through that surge, and it's hard, it's difficult. People, feel out of sync, like their life is disrupted, unfortunately, and they need to reset their brain, reset the brain. So emotional reasoning, that's a big one that we need to be aware of, right? For instance, you wake up in the morning, and you might be feeling kind of unmotivated and tired, and therefore you might conclude you're lazy. But you had a bad night of sleep. What if it's something else? What if it's in a state of inactivity, and you need to come out of it? Right? So sometimes we have a feeling, an emotion, and we conclude we are that, and we categorize ourselves in that situation, right? So we got to be careful to reason with our emotions, right? That's a paradox. You cannot reason with emotion, right? You cannot reason with emotion. You got to suit the emotion. You got to respond to the emotion. You got to recognize there is emotion, right? You don't want to be a robot, too, right? You got to recognize there is an emotion, but we have to find a way to respond to it differently, in a more active way. All or nothing thinking, or dichotomous thinking, sometimes they call it. View and threat in terms of anxiety. View and threat and safety in rigid, absolute terms as either present or absent. So this is all or nothing, right? Either we're all on the high of success and we're on top of the world, or we're on the low, depressed, and we're nothing, right? So we got to for a bipolar state. Not. I don't mean by it clinically, but a bipolar state, kind of cognitively, emotionally, where we're all this and we're nothing here. We have to find a way to balance it out, calibrate our thoughts and emotions. Beliefs related to anxiety, basically, they can fall in different categories. Some of the big ones are, again, intolerance for anxiety. Right, so some people may experience a little bit of anxiety, and if it's situational, they are compelled to have to do something about it, and you have to erase it completely. But a lot of times it's hard to erase anxiety completely. Maybe the goal might be to, again, react to it a little bit differently, right? Tolerate some of it and let some of it subside a little bit. There might still be some in there. But intolerance for anxiety, intolerance of uncertainty. Again, no one likes uncertainty, but Jesus says, in this world you will have tribulation, right? Amen. But take courage. I like that he doesn't end it there. In this world you have tribulation. He doesn't just leave you with that. You have tribulation, good luck. You have problems? Welcome to the world. Welcome to adulthood, right? In this world you have tribulation, but take courage. That's the response, right? So the response style has to be a little bit different than there's tribulation. Oh no, I can't cope. I can't deal with it. I am succumbed by it, and I need a life jacket, and I don't have any. I'm drowning. In this, but take courage. Respond with courage. Stand in front of the fear, and the fear will not look as fearful. But take. What does that mean when you think about I have overcome the world? In the context of mental health, I have overcome depression, anxiety, fear. I've overcome obsessive compulsive tendencies. I've overcome your sinful desires. All of that, Christ never sinned, and he knows your situation because he lived in our own bodies, but he never sinned, right? So we know we have a true refuge, a true way out. Another sort of domain of set of beliefs related to anxiety, novelty is perceived as threatening. So some people that become more like agoraphobic perhaps, or more socially anxious, or more attuned to their periods of panic attacks that they've had maybe intermittently, just that generalized anxiety that we talked about. People may start to kind of create their own inventory of avoidance, right? Meaning that they will try to avoid the situations where certain events happened and certain triggers led them to feel more anxious, perhaps even embarrassed, right? So what happens there is, unfortunately, you're narrowing your life. You're limiting your life. If someone had a panic attack, for instance, I don't know, at Walmart, can you avoid Walmart? I don't. Yeah, you can probably go to other stores, but you'll miss out on certain sales, right? So in that inventory, what happens is you check off things that are not helpful for you, and maybe even something new, right? Trying something new might be difficult. Again, novelty, right? A first meeting with a boss or other things. Novelty is perceived as threatening because why? Because you want to control everything about your life so that you don't experience distress. But that's not possible, is it? That's not possible. But Christ promises that he will walk with us every step of the way. Every step of the way. The way I put it here, kind of funnels or beliefs that lead to intolerance for anxiety, for instance. Some of these thoughts could be, or beliefs, I can't stand feeling anxious. If I don't control it, it will lead to something worse, right? The intolerance of uncertainty. I am vulnerable when feeling uncertain. So that might be the underlying belief. So we might want to ask ourselves, okay, why do I feel vulnerable when I feel uncertain? Right? Was it my upbringing? Was it something with my upbringing or where I was living, the neighborhood, the situation with my parents? Was it that I didn't learn ways to problem solve through certain things? How vulnerable do you feel And can you tolerate some of that vulnerability? And can you also anchor yourself? Other thing, right? And again, staying home and perhaps not learning more about the world or traveling, for instance, right? Now, in people that may meet criteria for anxiety disorders, they may even develop a fear of the physical sensations of anxiety. Like they call it anxiety sensitivity. Even just the fear. So it's like fear of fear, right? Worry about worry. So I'm worried about the fact that tomorrow, usually at this time, I get an anxiety response. So in a way, it becomes what we call meta worry. So it's so embedded in your experience that your life is sort of surrounded by aspects of worry. You worry about having anxiety. So it becomes a higher level of worry, and we have to dial down on that and focus on other aspects. Repeated anxiety may lead to a fear of palpitations, for instance, tension because you've had a panic attack perhaps, or just heightened anxiety, breathlessness, etc., experienced during episodes, believing that such symptoms may produce serious consequences, right? Someone that comes to the a lot of anxiety, the heart rate went up the roof, they get an EKG, a stress test and all that, and everything is within normal limits, right? It's unremarkable, and then they tell the person, well, you probably had a panic attack, right? So learning about certain situations, I think it's important to be able to communicate with yourself and your thoughts, emotions, what you do in a different way to try to find different strategies, and God will help you. Many individuals come to dread the physiological symptoms of anxiety and make. Now, we talked about the escape and avoidance. The outcome is imbalanced, right? Because as you try to escape those situations where you had a stressful response or a stress response, right? As you try to avoid those situations where you were anxious, perhaps, or avoid situations where like you felt like you were not yourself, well, the outcome is what? You prevent anxiety from declining naturally. Again, even in the realm of cravings, let's take a little side road. Even in the realm of cravings, if we're talking about, say, a binge eating problem, if the person notices that in their own profile of triggers, they realize that when they're anxious about something, right? If we try to work with that and we let the anxiety decline by itself, and we don't respond the usual way, so we expose ourselves to the, and we don't respond the usual way, then that anxiety can decline, the binge eating might decline, right, in this case. So I want to provide that example. So prevent anxiety from decline naturally. It prevents you from learning that dangerous thinking causing anxiety is false, right? That's the other aspect that we need to learn. If we run away from our problems, right away we face them, right at the outset of facing them, we're not going to learn that that response to the problems is actually false. We may kind of delay our ability to use other resources to face that problem, right? And the other thing is it can limit your life, as I said. You have a narrow experience of life. Now, in the brain, it's good to map it out just to have some information about why is it that we experience prominent depression, low mood, worthlessness, prominent anxiety, worry, apprehension, muscle tension, the things that we talked about that are associated with those syndromes. There's a cortex pathway and an amygdala pathway, and I'll show you a picture of the brain in a bit, but let's get into sort of the cortex pathway, right? So we talked about the prefrontal cortex, all right? And the cortex is the pathway of sensations, thoughts, logic, intuition, So it's decision centers of the brain, right? That is sort of like the conductor of the orchestra. And information from the world comes in through our senses, and it's interpreted differently by the cortex, by different parts of the cortex. We also have the thalamus, and it can come through there, which is like a relay station. It's a subcortical area, by the way. This is not cortex, the thalamus, subcortical. And that sends information to various lobes and for processing, interpretation, and so on. Then we have the frontal lobes. We talked about the prefrontal cortex. And it sort of synthesizes information, and it has executive functions, meaning, it tells you to stop, inhibit, go, plan, make decisions. If people did not have a prefrontal cortex, they would just be like, perhaps a little puppy that only responds to stimulus. Like, there's a fly, go after it. Oh, there's a little mice, go, if you're a cat, you're going to go after it. You become sort of just responding to stimulus without processing and understanding and attaching meaning to that. Now, the cortex pathway. The problem with the cortex pathway in anxiety is that it tends to anticipate. It tends to over-anticipate negative situations, right? It can predict future events, and you can start imagining. So imagination and visualization is important and can be a helpful strategy. But again, if you're taken by that, perhaps you start imagining certain expressions, certain things, and that becomes your set of focus. Again, given the ability for the prefrontal to anticipate, interpret, it can get stuck in loops of worry, right? Generalized worry. So again, cortex pathway, cortex-based anxiety, interpretations, images, worries created by the cortex, or anticipatory thoughts that create anxiety when there's actually no danger present. Right? When there's actually no danger present. Now, we talked about the cortex. We'll talk about the limbic system in a second right now, but there are areas like the amygdala below the cortical area. You see it right over there. That's it's located. That's an alarm system, the danger alarm system, right? The emotional center of the brain, we could say. But not only the amygdala, we have the hypothalamus for memory and other things. Now, they're left and right. It's called amygdala because it's almond-shaped. There's two of them, left and right hemisphere. Comes from the Greek word for almond. Again, the built-in alarm system, right? It just goes off almost reflexively. Before it can reach the cortex, right? It's wired to respond perhaps about 1/5 of a second. That's very fast before it can reach consciousness. The lateral nucleus and the central nucleus of the amygdala are wired to react this way. I said 1/5 of a second. And again, the thalamus is also involved in this. And that can send a stimulus or information to higher cortical areas, right? So again, the central nucleus is important. And the central nucleus connects with the hypothalamus and the brainstem, and it can activate a cascade of sympathetic nervous system processes, including the release of certain hormones like epinephrine, which is adrenaline, right? Now, sympathetic nervous system, autonomic nervous system is generally divided in two, right? One way to conceptualize it. The sympathetic nervous system is, we could say, fight, flight, or freeze response. Right? They're made up with neurons that go to various organ systems. And fight, flight, or freeze, pupil dilation, increased respiration. Your body is put in fight or flight, right? It's ready for action, ready to do something, right? The sympathetic, on the other hand, it's more of a rest and digest. Get your body for rest, relax, and digest. So parasympathetic, the parasympathetic, you can balance the sympathetic by allowing a relaxing experience leading to resting and digesting. So sympathetic, fight, flight, or freeze. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. Kind of like parachute down from the stress, right? And slowly find relaxation and more relief from that anxious state. Now, we have the amygdala also does create emotional memories. And the problem with that is that, again, we access those negative emotions in the face of fear. And if that becomes your experience, it can override other brain functions. So that's a real concern, right? So if you're only living and responding based on amygdala-based sheer threat and fear and apprehension, that can override, it can block. It's like it can hijack, right? It can hijack your frontal lobe, which you need to make other decisions and respond more adaptively. So this is sort of the pathway, right? Sensory information coming in from the world through the five senses: hearing, seeing, touching, smelling. It can go to the thalamus, that's a subcortical area, part of the limbic. And thalamus can either take it up to the cortex, or it can just go to the amygdala and you have an anxiety response. So in a split second, like 1/5 of a second, it's going to go from sensory quickly to thalamus, the amygdala, and your response, anxiety response. It can go the other way to the cortex, but then that can also activate the amygdala, and you have the anxiety response.
How do you prevent the amygdala from taking over?
So how do you prevent the amygdala from taking over? That's a great question. One part of that is to identify the fact that there are different triggers that we may have not taken into consideration, right? There are different things in the environment that we may have not. For instance, there's a story on a book about someone with PTSD. Right? So this person recovered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and after years, he had no symptoms. But one day, he went to take a shower, and when he went to take a shower, he suddenly had increased heart rate, increased respiration. He felt like he was having a panic attack. He felt like he was drowning. And so he started saying to himself, okay, I cannot take a shower now without having a panic attack. So he talked to his spouse, and they tried to figure out, well, did you do something different? No, I took the shower the same. Are you sure you didn't do anything different? Yes. Oh, yeah. Now I remember. What'd you do? I used a different soap that you had there. Oh, right, the wife told him. You used this brand that I bought. It's a new one. I left it there. Yeah, that's the only different thing I did. I used that soap. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that soap, right? No. But he remembered, he's like, yes, the brand of that soap. That's the issue. Why? Why is that a trigger? The brand of the soap was a trigger for this person because in the Vietnam War, he used to shower and he bought that brand. He bought soap using that brand. He showered in Vietnam during the war, and obviously, that was a trigger. So a lot of times we try to do top-down control, right? To quiet down the amygdala. We try to consciously send messages to the amygdala that whatever's becoming threatening for you, it's not a big deal. But a lot of times that works, and sometimes it doesn't work. So what we need to do, we need to figure out what's underlying that. Why is that a trigger? Oh, right, because my father or my mother yelled at me when I was a little child regarding this ice cream, and I came into the store, and I don't know why I was so anxious. I needed to leave that store, and then I remembered as I went home, calmed down, and examined why I was so anxious, I realized, it comes from sort of this negative experience that I had earlier in life. So we want to try to figure out what is underlying that anxiety, right? The anxiety response. Why? Because you perceive that fearful in this way. So then the next thing would be, okay, so we need to expose the amygdala to that situation and let anxiety rise through exposure, but respond differently, right? So that would mean don't leave the ice cream place, don't run away, but go in there with your friend and stay in there and just distract yourself with a conversation, strike a conversation about something that you like, right? So over time, the amygdala will readjust itself and it will see that, oh, that was a false alarm, right? Because you exposed yourself to that fearful situation, whether it's a specific place, or you could even expose yourself mentally and visually to that situation and realize that, okay, if crossing that bridge creates a panic attack, I need to visualize that I'm crossing that bridge and I can see the panic attack coming, but I can also see that I'm walking okay, I'm having courage, I can hold on. So one of the strategies is to expose yourself to that original fear and stay with it and respond differently. So that's exposure with response prevention, meaning change your response to that original fear. So that's one way to do it when we have an overactive amygdala. So sometimes we need to figure out, okay, if my amygdala, that fear center of the brain, is oversensitive and over-responsive, I need to go explore that, the origin of that, the root of that, and I need to go face my fear and see that it's not as bad as I thought it would be, right? So that was one way to deal with fear response coming from the amygdala. And so, and I put that image about neurons because it's important to note that experience is everything. Experience is key. The definition of neuroplasticity is basically that our nervous system, our brain and body changes in response to experience. So if you figured out what that amygdala-based fear is, and you stick with it, you face it, you don't run away from it, and you do other things like, you try to restructure your thoughts and you change the way you think around it, you take up that courage with you, then the connections in the brain, right, between neurons, between nerve cells and that synapse, those circuitries are going to be shifted and they're going to be acting a little bit different. So that's going to send a signal back down to the amygdala, telling it, and even in the amygdala itself, rewiring that part of the brain so that you learn something new and novel and you can actually overcome your anxiety and fear. So strengthening these connections between neurons is important. So neurons that fire together, wire together, right? Neurons that fire together, wire together. So if an object fired together with your response to that object, which was sheer fear, that gets reinforced, right? So now we expose ourselves to the fear, but we respond differently, then we're going to have another channel, another release of neurochemicals, and that means that you have two options now, or even 3 or 4 or 5, right? Remember, anxiety narrows your life? This exposure to fears opens up a realm of possibilities for you where you might be able to find that you have more strength than you thought you had, right? So changes lead to learning, modifying neural circuitries. Joseph Ledoux, a neuroscientist, said, people don't come pre-assembled, but are glued together by life. Experience is key. And what kind of experience, right? Of course. What kind? What specific experience do you have? Learn it, change it exponentially. Deliberate thoughts. Now, deliberate thoughts can actually modify our neural chemistry. So if you're having a cascade of negative, anxious thoughts, we need to find a way to modify that circuitry by deliberately changing our thoughts, reorganizing the brain, reorganizing your response to that. So again, we talked a lot about training the amygdala itself, retraining it. Again, let's just say that the amygdala is there to protect you, but sometimes it creates a lot of false alarms. The language of the amygdala, and I was just kind of giving you an example of that, it's learning through association, right? The connection between an object and fear, and I've already talked about that. Wiring a new response to triggers. Now, anxiety can also be produced by the cortex, not all the amygdala. Let's switch to now the cortex, where there's fusion, right? Where the cortex is prone to thinking that whatever you think is actual reality. It can confuse thoughts with reality. So we have to analyze what kind of thoughts we're having, whether they paint the whole picture, right? So tendency to believe that it holds the true meaning of all the thoughts. And that leads to distortions and misattributions, right? It is prone to misinterpretations. We may have illogical, unrealistic thoughts. Now, the left hemisphere of the cortex is more based on thoughts, and the right hemisphere more based on images, but they co-activate images and thoughts, right? Left hemisphere is for language. That's why the thoughts and language come into play. Right hemisphere is more imagery, but they co-activate in the brain. Now, rumination leads to depression, right? So the rumination is sort of a style of thinking that has to do with going over problems, really mulling over that, relationships, problems, and there's an intense focus on the effects or possible causes of those situations. So if you have a ruminative style, you might be more of a depressive person, and we kind of need to rewire that part of the brain. So ruminations leads to depressive symptoms. I won't be able to go over each of these situations, but we know that the right hemisphere has to do with visual, holistic integration, and so on, associated with a panic disorder a lot, again, because in panic, people visualize certain things. Vigilance, right, alertness. An image is worth 1,000 words, right? So people are over alert to images. So there's a movement here or there, or someone's eye contact changes. If that person has a little bit of PTSD, they might be, oh, it has an amygdala response, right? So the cortex has a certain pathway. We won't go over all of that. Again, the frontal lobes we develop and contemplate on future events. That can be good and bad. Now, mankind is not perturbed by events, but by their interpretation of them. It's good to remember this. A lot of times it's not the event itself, but the way we have imagined and interpreted and responded to the event, right? So if there's a fire truck near my neighborhood, for instance, I might interpret that as, oh no, my house is on fire and I lost everything. And the emotion is what? Heightened anxiety. Event, interpretation, emotion. And that can be a slippery slope. So again, the negative way. The power of anticipation, expectations that will occur, possible futures, which leads to threatening thoughts and images that fuel anxiety. So the cortex fuels anxiety, the amygdala by this alarm system that's over-responsive, right? And the cortex can also activate the amygdala itself. Just by the way you're thinking, you're acting fear, you're producing fear, and so on. And some strategies that I think are important to take into consideration, right? We talked about exposure for the amygdala alarm system. We talked about visual imagination, not only for the amygdala, but for the cortex. Cognitive restructuring is, again, changing your thoughts, which can change your emotions and can change your behaviors. Monitoring these thoughts, keeping a sort of an anxiety log can be helpful. Identify those thinking errors, right? Examine the evidence. Put your thoughts on trial, right? Put your thoughts on trial. Don't take thoughts as completely telling the true story of your experience, but put them on trial. Identifying the main anxiety triggers, right? The coping responses, what they are. Are you having helplessness thoughts, avoidance patterns? Are you seeking safety when you should actually seek more exposure to things? That's selective attention biases. You can even forge in a piece of paper or in your journal, you can have a gratitude journal. You can have a gratitude mindset, not just on Thanksgiving, but also on a weekly basis. Because if you're repetitively worrying, or if you're the past, right, which can lead to depression, you need to also think about things that you have that you have not been grateful for. Right? Basic things that some people don't have. Like people, there's a big war going on now, and people don't have the things that you used to have, but we have them. Let's think about that as well. So gratitude mindset, values. So I anchored my talk on important in terms of top down, right? So conscious brain down to the amygdala, or bottom up, changing the amygdala to help the conscious brain. But also values, right? So what is your value structure? What do you value? What's important for you? All right? Keeping in mind that because we go through distress, it doesn't mean that we have to forget and completely ignore our value structure. What is most important to you in your life? Is it money? Is it stability? If it's money, are you putting your values where you should? Money is a vehicle, but can I value something more than that, right? So the experience of family gatherings, vacation, traveling. What do you value? The Word of God, faith. These things are pillars to help us in times of need. We talked about visualization, right? So visualize and change the way you are forging a new image in the brain. So if you like hiking and you're a very anxious person, perhaps when you're hiking and you're afraid of new novelty situations, imagine just being there, right? Imagine just being there and take in everything about that previous experience with hiking, or previous experience that you had with your family member that you're anxious about if you have to call them, right? Think about the positive experiences you've had with them, how you've grown together even through troubles in life, right? So imagine these things and visualize these things. Ellen G. White talks about visualizing the final scenes of the Passion of the Christ, our Lord and Savior. As we visualize that, we take into consideration that He suffered it all so that I don't have to suffer completely, right? So we use that kind of visualization. It can change your perspective. It can activate another set of values in your life. Now, there are other things that I won't have time to get into too much, but changing your breathing, just breathing. That's breathing, by the way. It doesn't have to be anything like meditation, but it can just be changing the way you're breathing, right? So if you're inhaling too much, there might be an imbalance between the oxygen level and carbon dioxide level in your bloodstream. So if you're hyperventilating, that's going to be a problem. So you need to change your breathing, slow it down, diaphragmatic breathing, and exhale a little bit longer, because when you have your exhale a little bit longer, inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, exhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When you exhale a little bit longer, that activates the parasympathetic nervous system that has to do with resting, relaxing, calming down, right? Exercise is another one. The physiological side, by the way, just new research just came out on that. New research came out on that physiological side, which is a breathing technique, which is just doing this. So 2 quick breath inhales and exhaling through the mouth, that's been shown to be more effective than mindfulness meditation. Let's put it that way. Just doing this. That, for 5 minutes, has been shown to be more effective than other things like meditation, which you may not want to get into because of its roots in Buddhism, right? So exercise, regular sleep patterns, and so on. Now, new research has come out on other regions of the brain that we're going to be paying attention to, like the insula, which is a hub for reporting things to the conscious brain. Other parts of the prefrontal have become more of interest now. So the prefrontal is also like a flexible rule-setting structure. It can help in different contexts to switch the rules. So if you have a rule that is directed more towards thinking negative and more anxious, we got to find a way to do a little bit of quicker rule setting and shifting and modulating, right? So there's a part of the brain, the insula, and also the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that acts more of a hinge. It's like this modulation of your states of alertness and calmness, right? So this part of the brain, which is the insular cortex, can report to the conscious brain, to the prefrontal, physical states that you're in, right? So that can help a lot because as we're using more brain, we're going to be sending a signal to slow down our breathing if we need to, if that's creating more anxiety, a signal to we don't have a G issue or so on and so on and so forth. I don't have time to get into all the specifics about the research, but I did want to, by the way, this is the second stress response system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal response, which releases cortisol. Now, cortisol is fine, right? It falls normally throughout the day, but when stress is prolonged, we release too much cortisol, which is associated with inflammatory markers and other things. So that's a second stress response through the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals. But I did want to end with this concept of reconceptualizing stress. So in the last 2 minutes that I have, short-term versus chronic stress. Stress versus distress. Now, short-term stress can actually be good for you because it can energize your brain and body to complete tasks, right? And we need to realize that there's more than one stress response available to us. So if we are in a more of a challenge response, we're going to be able to navigate the challenge or the situation a little bit better. If we're more in the stress, and by stress I mean the distress response, where we feel like we cannot overcome the threat, then we're going to be succumbed by perhaps prolonged stress and chronic stress, where we are limiting our resources. So the ideal response is the one that gives you energy, helps you focus, and encourages you to act and embrace the challenge. That's the challenge response. So stress response, challenge response. There was a study, 2 or 3 studies done that showed that in a cardiovascular study, they studied folks that used more of the challenge response, physiologically speaking, and compared to controls, those that had more of a challenge response, where they stood up in front of the challenge, embraced the situation, responded differently with more courage, more determination, more planning, more problem solving, and so on and so forth, they had greater brain volume across their lifespans. Another study found that persons that adopted a challenge response to stress were less likely to be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome than those with a threat response. Again, threat response, challenge response, right? If we conceptualize it like that, we might be able to overcome. The Bible says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and be courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Isaiah 41:10, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And John 14:27 says, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. So when you're anxious, distressed, read these verses from the Bible. They'll give you a lot of relief and courage. And I want to leave you with these two quotes by Dr. McGonigal, PhD, clinical psychologist. In her book, she wrote, "Whatever the sensations of stress are, worry less about trying to make them go away and focus more on what you are going to do with the energy, strength, and the drive the stress gives you. Your body," but this is a challenge response, right? "Your body is providing you access to all your resources to help you rise to the challenge. Instead of taking a deep breath to calm down, take a deep breath to sense the energy that is available to you. Then put the energy to good use and ask yourself, what action can I take or what choice can I make that is consistent with my goal in this moment?" And she ends by saying, "Viewing the stress response as a resource can transform the physiology of fear into the biology of courage." And that's it, folks. Any questions? Any other questions?
I work with a man. I have been working with him for the past 6 or 8 months. When I first started working with him, he had a lot of knives. I think he had, what you call it, PTSD, something like that. And they used to be under his bed, under his pillow, and I was very uncomfortable with that, with the situation. But I didn't mention anything to him. I just began to pray and ask God to help me because I just started working with him. Sometimes he would be so depressed, I would go there for maybe 5 hours, and he would just stay in his room and just sleep for the 5 hours I'm there. I just finish my work and go. So, what you're talking about today, like the situation when I saw these knives, but now I don't see them anymore. I don't know where he put them, but I don't see the knives anymore. Yeah, but I was very uncomfortable with that situation. He doesn't have any guns, but he has these like daggers, and that made me extremely uncomfortable.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, so and a lot of folks, unfortunately, are held captive by their nervous system that has been subject to a lot of trauma or a lot of other experiences. So, like you said, maybe you said he or she might have PTSD, right? You said, yeah, and obviously PTSD can also exacerbate depression, anxiety as well. So some people may be in sheer fear of things, and they may have knives. Now, if the person wasn't suicidal, the knives were more of a protective thing. But if they were suicidal, then that's a concern, obviously a big concern. But yeah, a lot of people are struggling. A lot of people are, again, they're experiencing a lot of things in life, and they need a way out. They need a refuge. They need an anchor, and they'll hold on to whatever makes them feel a little bit more comfortable, right? And that might be maladaptive, meaning it might be not good for you, right? Some people that are depressed may have a compulsion or obsession or an attachment to things in their house, and they might hoard things, right? Because those things have sort of an emotional meaning to them. And they may have a very disorganized house would have piles of things everywhere. Yeah, so that's hoarding. That's another problem, right? That's a whole different topic. But yeah. Again, in general, I think about the nervous system. What has impacted their life, and how has the brain changed because of those experiences, and why do they have these symptoms, right? Any other questions? Yeah.
Yes, my question is because for those children, special needs children.
Yeah.
Special needs children. But I'm driving one since many, many years. But each time, I don't know, because he cannot talk, but he understands. But he's not deaf. Because when you're deaf, you cannot talk. But he's not deaf, but he cannot talk. I don't know what kind of sickness he has. But you can see his mind can shift all the time when you're talking about cognitive errors. I wonder if he's not suffer with those kind of things, because sometimes you do things and then for many months or many weeks. But these days, the only thing he's doing now, every time I'm driving it, he keeps shaking the bus. I'm on the highway, and it make me nervous. Because of the way he stops slowly, and then boom, boom. And then the car shaking. I don't know what's going on with me and him, because I'm down in control. But for him, I don't know what's going on in his mind. It's like those kind of, I don't know. Can you explain me, please?
Yeah, no, that's a clear danger situation there. Yeah. You're driving, the student is shaking the bus. It's gonna make everyone feel a little bit uncomfortable, right?
The worst part, I'm leaving, this week will be my last week with him. And
that's good.
No. Because my boss, they are not happy. The mom is really controlling, but my chemistry with the mom, the parents are really good. They don't understand why my chemistry are so good with them. They don't want to talk to me. I want to let them know what's going on. But they give me about face. I say, keep your about face for yourself, I'll keep mine. But it will be the same, because each time he has something, his brain shift, nobody can know. And when he doesn't know someone, oh my goodness, he doesn't even look at you. That mom is nervous, he's the one, and the office, they don't understand how I deal with them, they will be in trouble.
Yeah, it's a complex issue with someone with special needs, even if also, that person may have some severe autism spectrum disorder, right? So sensory information is processed differently for children and adults like that. Some have very high functioning autism spectrum symptoms, but when we talk about that, we think of, they're gonna be triggered by different situations, right? And they may find safety or soothing behaviors by engaging in certain behaviors that to average human beings are not adaptive, right? So, because it can be a dangerous situation, someone's moving and the bus needs to be still to keep everyone safe. But yeah, so that requires sort of helping the child to respond differently to whatever is happening internally. We have to figure out what that is, what those triggers are. Yeah.
I just have a question. I don't know how to explain it, but I can be thinking of nothing, and I can have anxiety just come on me. My husband will ask me, well, what were you thinking about? And I say, I wasn't thinking about anything. I was just relaxing. So what is causing that?
Great question. So you can't pinpoint any direct influence from your contemplation at the moment if you were contemplating on something negative or aversive, right? You can't really pinpoint that. You're just reacting. So not to delve too deeply into this, but there might be, certain experiences in your life that we need to kind of examine a little bit through individual therapy. We need to examine if there have been some negative experiences in your life early on that may have shifted your nervous system to become a little bit more overreactive to seemingly safe situations, right? So say, you're at home sitting down watching a nice movie, or if you're home sitting down talking to your children, and there's nothing really anxiety-provoking coming from the environment, then it's coming internally. And why is it coming internally? We need to examine a little bit further. But I suspect that there's something about the emotional center of the brain, the amygdala, for instance, that it's just over-responsive, even to things that are benign or neutral, right? So there might be sort of, that person may have in this case, if it's you or someone else that may be experiencing, right, it's you, more of a generalized, over-responsive emotional, physiological experience. So it's not you that your brain is creating these stressors. You know, you're not consciously putting yourself in a tornado of negative thoughts. It's your nervous system creating it for you. So that means that it's going to require some, maybe cognitive processing therapy, or if there's a little bit of, negative experiences in your life, you might have some people may have, subclinical PTSD, where it's not quite PTSD, but their nervous system is just a little bit over responsive to things. We need to figure out why, and we need to try to attach new meanings to new situations, right? And sometimes medications can help, right? In these cases, you might find out that finding a new lifestyle can help as well, But yeah, it's going to require a little bit more examination. But I suspect, it's more of that physiological amygdala response that, for whatever reason, we need to figure out why the nervous system is more sensitive, right? And it's interpreting benign or neutral situations as threatening. That's what's happening. It's interpreting, your nervous system is interpreting as threatening, and it's creating these responses. Additionally, I didn't discuss this in the talk, but there are also, for instance, in panic attacks or in anxiety disorders, we may have a propensity to them just by genetics as well, right? So you may have someone in your family line, your grandparents or... My mother. Okay. Right, so genetics plays a role too. Yeah, so now epigenetically, meaning environment plus genes, we got to figure out something that you can do to respond so that you can have the amygdala respond with less sensitivity, right? But not sure if all that helps that I just mentioned. But I'm suspecting, that genetics as well plays a role. And it does for not only anxiety, but depression and other things.
So can I call you Dr. D?
Yes.
Dr. D, it sounds like we do need some Christian psychologists. So for Christians, yeah. So we will welcome you to the area. Do you have a private practice?
No. I work at UMass.
Okay. UMass Worcester.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a good question, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Back here.
How do you differentiate a period of sadness or a sadness episode versus depression? As a former high school teacher, I find like there's a overuse of the term depression.
Yeah.
And I have a student in middle school right now who she's always talking about how depressed she is. And she's anxious about, just as you said in the presentation, things that have not even happened yet. And so I wonder, how can we, as parents, as teachers, just know the difference between a period of sadness versus a true chronic need?
Great question. So in clinical depression, to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, for instance, you need to meet at least five indicators, 5 symptoms criteria to be diagnosed with it. So in the past 2 weeks, right, if you experienced prominent depressed mood, prominent worthlessness, passive suicidal thoughts, difficulty concentrating, low appetite or overeating, weight changes perhaps, anxiousness, hopelessness, helplessness, and so on. All of these symptoms, we need to see them, kind of happening in a substantial way, like predominantly every single day. So that would be a depressive, for instance, a major depressive disorder. And again, clinical depression can rise, meaning it can come in episodes where people may have it for a month and then they have perhaps 2-3 weeks where they're in remission. But versus a period of sadness, it would be more of a situational issue. There's a problem, someone's boyfriend, girlfriend broke up with them, and they're just feeling kind of sad about that, right? So that's situational. And it hasn't created other symptoms like the ones I mentioned, like hopelessness. The other one I didn't mention is one more, for instance, anhedonia, which is the inability, the incapacity to feel reward and pleasure, where they just feel like nothing fills them, right? So that's another symptom of major depressive disorder. But if it's more of a fleeting situational or just a period of sadness where they respond to a breakup or they respond to bullying for a little bit of period of time, it may not reach clinical depression. And so we need to figure out what that is, differentiate it. But also, parents can really help the child to understand that there are certain things that child can do to combat the tendency to respond in this fashion, knowing that, as parents, you're going to be supporting them, the teachers that can be aware of that. If the grades have dropped, if they're not as concentrated, okay. We need to find a way to help them to perhaps even activate neurotransmitters in the brain like dopamine and serotonin by exercise, by engaging in certain activities, and so on and so forth. But to make a long story short, yes, there are some differences. And sometimes, we may use the word depression, but it's best to probably just say depressive symptoms, right? Instead of just say depression, because then what could happen is you attach a label to that word, depression, and maybe you don't have every symptom of depression. You have some low mood or some low energy, but you still want to get up. You're still going to work. You're still going to school. You're still finding enjoyment in creativity. You haven't lost the joy of life completely, right? So maybe you don't have clinical depression. You have some reaction to stress in this way that might be a milder form, right? Any other questions?
Doctor. So while you were discussing vulnerability and triggers for anxiety, you had the scenario of the person going to the supermarket, and in most instances, people are in advance anticipating that something is going to happen, which triggers the anxiety, and then you give a couple of coping mechanisms of how to deal with that. In the event it is real, let's say they did go to the supermarket and whatever the anxiety is did happen, are the coping mechanisms the same for that scenario as it is for them anticipating?
So for instance, if they have this anticipatory anxiety about, if I go to a supermarket, I'm going to encounter my coworker who is very disrespectful and will say something and trigger me. So the person's thinking this, like, okay, all right, I need to expose myself to that fearful situation. That's something I don't know the future. Now they go to the supermarket, and lo and behold, there's the coworker, and the coworker comes and they're sarcastic with him. Ha! See, my anxiety, it was there to help me. Well, that's again, no one knows the future except God, and at times we can apply the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's why it's dangerous if you remain in a conscious anxiety state where you're always anticipating the worst, right? Catastrophic thinking. Because you're setting your mind up for that, you may inadvertently experience that. Now, yes, it could happen that it was a coincidence too, right? So the goal that would be to help the person not generalize, not conclude that this is always going to happen, right? So we want to dial down on that generalization, right? So we want to tell the person, okay, so do you believe now that you have to be apprehensive and anxious all the time to avoid all these things? Like, yes, because, see, that's, so we want to be able to help the person understand that, one, maybe self-fulfilling prophecy contributed to it. Two, no one knows the future. This could have happened just by sheer chance. And just because it happened by sheer chance doesn't mean it's going to happen every time that you go to the supermarket. You're going to encounter that coworker that was sarcastic or disrespectful. No, because that means 100% of the time. Say if you go to the supermarket twice a week, times that by how many weeks we have per year, 52, 54 times, that's a huge number. So you gotta tell the person, examine these possibilities. What is the probability of this actually happening? Yeah, it can't happen every single time. So, it's a coincidence, maybe a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we want to help the person interpret that in a balanced and adaptive way. Good question, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, can news or over-consuming of social media cause anxiety?
Yes, actually, we have seen a surge of anxiety in children and adolescents since the inception, one way to put it, since smartphones, technology in that fashion have, I think 2008 was the year that the iPhone came out, the smart iPhone. Might have been 2008, 2007, 2008, something like that. And everybody having, a smartphone, and then you have access to social media, you have access to the internet, which can be good and bad, right? You have instantaneous access to very helpful helpful information, but you also have access to social media where there's bullying, there's other aspects. And children have actually, some of them committed suicide because they have been bullied online through social media. So stress and anxiety there's a correlation between increased anxiety among children and adolescents and the rise of technology like smartphones and iPads and so on, and pads. And so there's a correlation between that. So yes, yep. It's a platform that it can become a slippery slope. Because again, also there's anonymity, right? So there could be other children or teens bullying others. And since in social media you don't see them, they're hiding behind the screen. It's more anonymous for them. They might even create a fake name. And I'm not going to be in trouble because So yeah, that's a good question. It's becoming a pandemic too. That aspect, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so we've gone almost an hour and maybe 40 minutes. Wow.
Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you for the questions, and thank you for the invitation. Hopefully it provided some bases and foundations for thinking around stress, anxiety. And again, I didn't cover a lot of depression, but at some other point in the future, that could be the main focus. But yeah, hopefully it helped to learn more about the anxiety response, the stress response, and the resources that we have to respond differently to these things. And God has our backs.